Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Being that it is now after 6 p.m. on Monday, April 30th, 2018, I'll call to order the Board of Selectmen's meeting. If we could all please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. First item on the agenda is discussion and options for the water and sewer rates for fiscal year 2019 with the water superintendent.
Do we want to wait for Greg to do this one? So the board can see?
Let me just pull it in and out.
I was just gonna drop it, I got nervous.
Just don't hit your head on
That's true.
How many town officials does it take to?
Plug in an HDMI cable. Take a spill.
Here it is.
Hey, sort of.
One here,
And there's
one
your-
there, there you go.
But
Perfect.
that one's still not the presentation.
Here it
Whoop,
comes.
there you go.
Presentation here.
Got it, Doug. Whoop, beautiful.
We're good. Go ahead.
Okay.
All right.
Good evening, everyone. I have provided another presentation, and if you'll indulge me, I have several slides that provide some more background information regarding the capital improvement plan and our revenue before we get into some of the alternatives for the rate increase. So go ahead, Heather. What you'll see here is a graph of the water main that's been installed by decade. In blue, you'll see the cast iron unlined, and then in red, the cement line cast iron, and then on to the right, the green is the ductile iron with cement lining, which is now the industry standard. What you'll notice there are those first three columns to the left in blue. We are 2 years from having all three of those columns be over 100 years old. That's about 11 miles of pipe that are over 11 years old. Go ahead, Doug. So how long does that get us? Industry standard so far is cast iron that was made up until 1920 has an average lifespan of 125 years. That's been generated by some research projects based on break history and information from water systems all across the country. So that's the average. Pipe could make it 150 years, but just as many have to fail below that to get the average to be 125 years. Cast iron main after 1920 was manufactured differently than pre-1920, and it has a shorter lifespan of 100 years. And then they estimate the cast iron that has cement lining made after 1950 would also have a 100-year lifespan. The ductile iron pipe that's been installed after 1976 is anticipated to have an 85-year life expectancy, and that may increase as we get closer to that 85 years, but those are the industry expectations for those materials. So again, we have 11 miles of pipe that are very close to its end of its life cycle. Go ahead. So to provide the board and the residents a little more information about the capital improvement plan, is to do a replacement program, we assume the useful life of the pipe is 100 years. We have pipe that's 100 years old, and the industry standard for 11 miles of our pipe says it might make it to 125 years. But conservative replacement program would be about 1% replacement per year. That's a slow, steady, consistent rate. We're not trying to play catch up. I've seen comments from people that say, why are the current ratepayers being saddled with this extra expense? We're not playing catch-up. We're not going to spend $10 million in one shot to try to get those 10 miles or 11 miles of pipe rehabilitated. It's going to be a slow and steady process to chip away at this. So if we do 1% per year, we have 70 miles of pipe, that's 3,700 feet a year. Rough estimate is $200 per foot. It will vary based on size. Obviously, the larger diameter pipes cost more per foot than the shorter ones. And also, it dictates on how complicated it is to actually get into the ground and open up the pipe, more other utilities to deal with and so forth. But that's a rough estimate. That's not a total inclusive cost. That's to do the replacement. So if we do 3/4 of a mile a year, it comes out to about $750,000, and that gets back to what I mentioned at our last meeting and maybe even the meeting before that, that the industry standard is roughly $1 million a mile, and that's regardless of whether we trench the road and put brand new pipe in the ground and cover it, or we do discrete holes and clean and reline those pipes. So that gives you a ballpark. We do have identified all the sections of pipe in town that are old, and we've come up with a strategy to replace those based on break history, water quality complaints, age of the pipe, and then the ability for that water to transmit, ability of that pipe to transmit water based on how much tuberculation is in it. So we do have a list, and we would be going forward with that list with this plan. I put up two quotes here. I'm not going to necessarily read them to you, but it's been brought up, these points have been brought up on a number of different occasions and publications in the last decade. The first one essentially says that the federal government is really no longer carrying the ball for infrastructure replacement. Currently, they do provide millions, if not billions of dollars for water infrastructure replacement, and they divvy that up to states through the state revolving fund. Actually, Massachusetts has a greater need this year, so they will be getting more federal money, but it's a small pot of money, and we were the recipient of it with the treatment plant SRF fund, but every year there is just a finite amount of money, and the burden to replace these water mains is falling more and more on the ratepayer. And then that second comment there is essentially everyone is really hesitant to raise the rates to support this type of infrastructure improvement plan. So the next question is, well, how much should we be paying? The DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, has come up with a rough guideline for an affordability index that says that between 1.25% and 1.75% of the median household income should be earmarked towards water main improvement or the water department in general. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency puts that number at 2%. So I just ran some numbers to give us an idea of where we're at with respect to this guideline. And Webster median household income, pulled that off the internet, is $46,000. 1.25% of that is $579. The upper limit would be $811. The Webster average bill for 2016 was $419, and then for this past year was $390, both of which are below that lower threshold. The median bill for 2016 was $305, and then $279 for this most current year. You'll see the median is actually lower than the average, meaning the data is skewed to the right, tapers off to the right because we have fewer high users. So 50%, the median is a 50% mark, so 50% of the accounts for last year paid less than $279 for the bill. Our minimum bill is $107 per year, $26 per quarter times 4. So 50% of our accounts have an annual bill of $107 to $279. That's not a lot of money if you look at it in that respect. But that's the expectation to help departments across the state adequately fund the departments. So where does our revenue come from? The top 5% of our accounts generate 35% of our revenue. 10% of the accounts give us 45% of our revenue, and the top quarter of our accounts account for 64% of our total revenue. takeaway is we have a large portion of our revenue comes from a small percentage of our customers. Those are our commercial, industrial, medical facilities, apartment complexes, strip malls, and so forth. There are a couple high-end residential users, but for the most part, that is, those top 5% are all commercial accounts for us. So we have a lot of money coming from a small percentage of accounts, and then most of our bills are below what the guideline suggests for the median household income. So was my summary to give everybody a little background on what the plan is and where we stand. The board had asked for me to come up with some other options for funding this, with the main goal, the minimum requirement, the main goal of the rate increase is to meet our financial obligations for the money that we borrowed for the treatment plan. So we have increased expenses starting in FY20 that we have to raise revenue to meet that. And then any additional revenue would go towards this capital improvement plan. Option one, what we discussed at the last meeting, would be an $80 per year capital improvement fee and a 2% rate increase. And that spreads the capital improvement costs equally among all accounts. Everybody would pay the same amount, whether it's a mansion with 6 bathrooms or it's a rancher with 1.5 baths and high efficiency toilets and so forth. Option two would be a flat rate increase to get the revenue that we would need to get over this increased debt expense, would be a 14% rate increase, again with a 2% rate increase thereafter. This brings our revenue, ties our revenue to consumption, so we have more revenue coming from those few accounts, and should there be a wet year and we don't use much water, then our revenue would go down. And the third option is a combination of those rate increases and fees, and there are endless possibilities for that, but I picked an 8% rate increase with a $32 per year capital improvement fee, which balances both the revenue coming from fixed fees and consumption. So what I have is I've generated some graphs very similar to what you've seen before. This is the exact same graph that you saw last meeting, but I did add 2 more columns there for FY28 and FY29. And the $20 per bill or $80 per year fee, we'll see that red line for everyone at home. The red line at the top is the revenue, and then those columns underneath are various parts of our operating budget. The bottom line there in green is our revenue, our retained earnings, which is basically what we have in our savings account that we could spend through warrants at town meeting. And that bottom black line with the squares is the minimum amount that we'd like to keep in our retained earnings to be able to fund any type of emergency or to purchase trucks and so forth, replace trucks and equipment. So this is the graph that we saw at our last meeting, and with the 2% rate increase and the $20 per bill fee, that allows our revenue to meet our goals for capital improvement, would allow us to technically take 4 $2 million loans, as well as be able to afford to pay 2 small projects out of retained earnings going forward. So that's what we discussed at the last meeting. Second option would be purely just a rate increase, and I had to bump back the first year of the loan to accommodate that, because FY20 is a pretty heavy year for debt. But I've moved back the years for the bonds. With this model, we are still technically able to support four loans and do 2 projects spread out over an 8-year project, 8-year time span. The third option is the combination of those 2, and again, I picked an 8% rate increase, 2% thereafter, and then with an $8 per fee or $32 per year increase. And option 2 and option 3, Doug, if you could toggle between those 2, essentially look almost identical. From a $4 million or $3.5 million y-axis, you really can't see much of a difference between those 2 on the large scale. The next graph and the next slide has the increase, how the respective impacts to the residents. The existing line there is what the current rate is, and based on an annual average use of 7,500 550 cubic feet, which is what the residential average is. The annual bill for water would be $404. Option 1, with the $80 per year capital improvement fee and the 2% rate increase, would result in an $88 per year increase, which is the 22% increase from the previous year. Option 2, which is the 14% increase, just a straight rate increase, would result in a $56 per first year increase. And then option 3, which has the 8% and then the $32 per year, is roughly a 16% increase, which is $65 per year. My next slide is just the same summary slide that I had from the last meeting, wrapping up, talking about the aging infrastructure and the water quality. But the bottom line is that we need to adjust the rates somehow to meet the existing debt as well as to do anything in the future. So if you want to go back one slide, that was really the last slide of my presentation.
That slide there is different than the slide we have.
Yeah,
there.
Yeah.
I made some adjustments in the afternoon.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay,
so
thank you.
the presentation on the screen is more up to date than what you have in your packets.
Thank you very much.
Option 2 is the only thing that I think I changed, went from a 12% to a 14%.
If you go back to the chart with option 2, on our pages, it doesn't have that fourth $2 million loan.
Yeah.
Right,
And-
yeah.
and
And
it's-
that
we
results in the 12% go to 14.
Yes,
Right.
Yes.
Yep.
That's essentially the only change that I made to what you have in your packet.
So I realize that the board probably would like to maintain the least impact for the average resident. We recommended last time the $20 per quarter plus the 2% because we feel that that's more equitable across the board. And these are infrastructure improvements, and the infrastructure costs for a low user and a high user are pretty much the same. So that is originally why we recommended that. But you know, we realize that this is a policy decision, so we'll let the board decide how you want to do that.
So, Mr. Chairman, when I happened to be talking to Doug on Earth Day, we were doing our trash talking and trash picking up, it suddenly hit me that the vote we had taken was really impacting the average user and the low user significantly, and the high user didn't see the really big impact that I thought maybe they probably should. So, you know, to me, it made sense to go back and revisit this. I mean, I think option 2 to me is better. Even a high user, you know, they're the ones that are using the water, so to me, they're going to get more of the fee. There's an argument that, you know, maybe they should get a benefit because of infrastructure costs, but to me, the water has to travel through the same pipes. If they're using more, it's traveling more through all those same pipes. So if you thought of friction in pipes, you know, there's an argument that, you know, that water running through all those pipes creates more wear and tear on the pipe. So to me, I'm okay without the you know, quarterly fee. I thought the quarterly fee when we talked about it originally was to help stabilize the revenue, so that in case we had a wet year. But do we have any information? I mean, it doesn't seem as though maybe our volume of water usage changes that much, so we wouldn't have to worry as much about a wet year.
And again, this is just a spreadsheet model that we picked the consumption that was average, and we did 2% raises, and we know, the only thing we know out 10 or 15 years is how much our principal and interest is going to be, because that's been charted for us. But that's a spreadsheet model, and we probably are pretty good for 2 or 3 years, and just like the forecasts, after 5, 6 years, you start getting some more uncertainty. But I mean, our consumption, I haven't been here long enough to really dive into that to see how much fluctuation we have from year to year. I know in previous communities that have more outside irrigation, and that weather changes have dramatic impacts to revenue based on outdoor water use.
I wouldn't think it would change to you.
Right, so before Greg was here, we worked with the consultants, and they said, you know, typically towns now are seeing a decrease in use each year because people are using more water conservation efforts, the low flow toilets and shower heads, things like that. Webster, however, has stayed pretty steady and actually had maybe a slight increase. So for our projections, we we assumed a steady rate, so. Yes, we did originally put the $20 in there because it's more stable for the town, but as far as it being a risk moving to a straight percentage increase, I think it's a risk that Greg and I are willing to live
And
with.
that wouldn't, sorry, Andrew, through the chair, that wouldn't affect our borrowing abilities, capacity, if we went with a quarterly fee or
No,
went just a straight
no,
increase?
No.
14%, through the chair, 14% just seems high as an option. I mean, especially when we've gone from, we've had 0, we've had
Yeah.
2, and even if doing option 1, 2%, and then I knew at the last meeting when we took that vote that that wasn't gonna fly. The the quarterly charge, or the per bill charge. But 14% just seems, I mean, it seems to make sense, but it just seems high. And then the following year, we go to 2%, correct?
And that's the way I had modeled it,
Right.
essentially for 5 years, and then I stopped.
Yeah, and, go ahead.
To me, and I don't know who the biggest water payer is in town, but I took, let's say some company uses $300,000 a year
Hmm.
of water. So, and forget a minute for about the quarterly fee. They're gonna get a 2% increase on that 300,000. That's $6,000 a year. A 14% increase
Hmm.
would be $42,000 per year. That seems to be a really big benefit for that big user. And who pays for it? When we saw the chart from the previous time, those average users went up, well, you can see it there. The average user increase is 22%. So that's the average person. People with lower usage actually have a higher percentage
Right.
because the fee,
Correct.
quarterly fee is
Correct.
Right.
more significant. So, I think we also talked about the fact that because we haven't had those rate increases for, absent last year, for 4 or 5 or 6 years, had we had that 3%, we would have had 12, 14, 15, 16%. Now we're just finding it all cumulative.
Sorry.
And
It-
I believe some of the previous presentations during the course of bringing the treatment plant online or getting support did have, I think, like 2 or 3 10% rate increases. So there was an expectation that, the bond rating, not the bond rating, the amount of debt that we would have was going to increase significantly by FY20, and there would have to be steps to meet that without drawing down retained earnings to
Yeah,
meet those obligations.
to that point, yeah, previous forecasts showed like an 8% this year and an 8% next year. And so that's always an option, that you can do multiple large ones. I think it's easier for the town and easier for actually residents to just have one big hit and then have a small steady growth after that.
Through the chair, if
Yeah, go right
if I may. What I have found is you almost have a fee on a fee, I think, which some people might not agree with, even though it might be, whether it be $32 or $20 or any dollars, or $80 at the end of the year. But I think it was quite a few years ago, we went up at one time 16%, and the recommendation was 25. And we didn't have quarterly billing either. And then we got into quarterly billing, which would create a better cash flow, and also if a customer had a problem, it would be easier to hopefully find it. I'm kind of going toward the 14, because it would give you, we're gonna get hit one way or the other. We have a lot of projects to do, and I think the board, and you, of course, yourself and Mr. Doran prior to you, have done a wonderful job trying to, we can't solve the problems overnight, we know that, but we have multiple problems, I think, which the board, as far as replacing pipes in different areas, virtually replacing them, is only one part. We have the filtration, which is the big chunk, but if, of course, if we replace pipes, we'd be doing that forever. But we gotta make sure too that 10 years from now, or 9 years from now, or 8 years from now, there's enough money to pay this down and/or move forward with it. And we are gonna be hurt for the next several years, there's no getting around it, regardless if you're just paying $100 and some odd a year, or unfortunately, we don't have the industry that we did as far as like, textile and shoe companies anymore, which were big users, but be that as it may, what we have now, that's how I feel on it. I just assume, and I think when I get home I'll hear it too, but I think we've got to take the bull by the horns, because you don't want to hear the complaints from people.
No,
We don't
no.
want to hear them, I'm sure, and we have to fix it.
And even if, when the treatment plant's online in 12 or 14 months and we have crystal clear water coming out, and that's, technically, if that were to solve the dirty water,
That'd
we
be
still
great.
have an
Oh.
infrastructure problem.
Exactly.
So they overlap a little bit in the dirty water, but the fundamental problem is that we have to address this.
Yes.
It's not an inexpensive undertaking, so we have to plan.
And I can see where, like Mr. Becker had stated, with the quarterly fee of $20, if you take our average base user gets the flat fee of $107, and now you add $80 onto that, that's almost a 63% increase in the year. And if 50% of our users are at that lower end of the threshold, that's a big impact to them. Whereas if you do the 14% option too and spread it out, that's about a $15.98 roughly increase on, if you're on 107, you
Mhm.
add 14% to that.
It's how you want to slice the
Yeah,
pie. It's,
absolutely.
Right.
I think, Mr. Chairman, what's good about the presentation, maybe the additional information here is, you're stating in the presentation that we need to spend basically $1 million a year. And across every one of these scenarios, you've got a $2 million tranche of borrowing every other year, which is, okay, that's great, that's the $1 million a year. So we know what we need to spend, we now know what it's gonna cost, and it's simply a matter of how you're gonna pay for it. So, I too think that the 14%, in light of our discussions from the previous meeting, is a fairer way to do it.
Do we have a motion from the board?
So move, we'll go,
So
Mr.
moved.
Becker. So move second.
So we have a motion and a second for
Second,
the
Mr. Chairman.
14% increase. Is there any discussion?
I would just make clear that it's rescinding the previous one, and this is 14%.
Correct.
So I'll include
Yeah.
that in my motion.
Yeah.
I'll second that amendment.
All right, so we have a motion and a second to rescind the previous vote of the board to do the $20 a month
Yep.
per
Quarter.
quarter capital improvement fee, and instead do a 14% rate increase across the board. Is there any other discussion?
Other than thank you for the different models, I think
Thank
that's
you.
a great thing to have, to make some choices.
Makes it
And I-
easier.
And I do see we have some residents here, so I'll open it up to
Oh,
any questions from the residents. Yes, right here, Diane?
I had a question about going forward. You were talking in one of the earlier slides that you needed to do $750,000 a year for pipe replacement to cover the 11 miles of pipe that's around 100 years old. What happens after that 11 miles? Are you going to be replacing $750,000 in perpetuity?
I'm not going to say yes, but we have the problem is we have old pipe, and then it's the unlined cast iron. So, and there is a good chunk, 50% of our system is that unlined cast iron, which would be great to have that relined and clean and relined. I can't shoot that far in advance. I mean, that's 10, 15 years out. But you have to remember that we are always moving. That it's like a conveyor belt. We're always moving, and those pipes are getting older. So
Right, so the first 3 columns you said was 11 miles.
correct.
And what about column 4?
By the time we get done in 10 years, that's going to be
Right.
queued up for the next one. Yeah.
And then the ones that we installed in the 50s and coming forward have a shorter useful life.
Yes. It's the same issue that every other department is having as
So
well.
the 2% that you're presenting to going forward is not going to cover that, is it?
The 2% rate
Is it
increase
14,
or
right, the 2% rate increase?
That would allow us to borrow every other year, essentially $1 million per year.
Forever. If
Yeah,
that's-
I mean, if we
And-
kept going the 2%.
Yes,
yeah.
and the green line there, the green bar on the graphs is our existing debt, that will go down, but the blue line would get bigger because that's our newer debt. So, you have to strike a balance between expenses and revenue.
And the 2 million every other year covers the payments for the filtration plant as well?
Yes, yeah, that's, the filtration plant's actually in the green.
Okay.
That's why you see in FY '20, that's the tallest.
But I think it's important to realize that all of our pipes are gonna be getting older, and we are, if we really wanna manage the system properly, we need to be replacing or relining or whatever pipes constantly.
That-
Otherwise, we'll just be in the same crisis
We'll only be
3
behind
or 4
for-
years from now.
Correct.
It's almost like it's almost like the way we, think of it as the way we monitor the paving of the streets and how all the paving is on a schedule for replacement, repair. Can we patch this? Can we overlay? Do we have to redo it? You extend the life cycles.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
if I may, I think at our last meeting, we also mentioned that on some of the troublesome streets or areas, I think you picked out 3 or 4, if I'm not mistaken, and that was a start, and then we would continue from
Correct.
that point on. Whether they had to be replaced, I think they were gonna be replaced, and then others were also with the lining.
Correct, and
Am I
there
correct?
are improvements in here to our system. There's a
Mhm.
section, we could use a larger section of pipe on Worcester Road, because it goes down Old Worcester, and that's a smaller diameter pipe. To make an improvement to our system, that would be a new pipe that would go in, that would help the hydraulics of the system. That would be something we'd step away from the relining of tuberculated main to put in a section of new pipe to help the hydraulics. So that's all within the plan that Ty and Bond has put together.
Mr. Chairman, I think, Greg, you hit the nail on the head a few minutes ago when you said, you know, the budget is really looking good, clear, 1 and 2 years out, and it's very unclear 5, 10 years out. And the lack of clarity is also interest rate driven. We don't know what a $2 million loan in 2026 is gonna cost. God forbid, you know, for us, interest rates go up to 5%. Your 2% that you expect to increase now could be 4%.
Correct.
Right.
Ad
And this is-
infinitum.
And this is something every year we will have to address and go through this and monitor. And there may be times where we can't afford to do it.
But I think to Ms. Mandiel's comment, it would be good to have like almost a PERT chart going out.
There is,
have to
and
be able to
there's a
create that.
name of a certain chart that you can generate in Excel, and it shows you what, if you were to move this conveyor belt of aged, and it would show you, yes, in 5 years, we're gonna have a lot, technically, a lot to do that year. But it'd be like, can we get another 5 years? You know, it's a little gray zone, but there is a chart that I just haven't had time to generate yet.
And I think once we have that, we'll have a better idea that maybe knowing, let's say, 20 years from now, if we increase rates instead of 2%, we increase them 3.5, we'll then have built up that pot of money to hit that big. That's probably, you know, maybe, I'm guessing more Diane's point.
Right, and if you look on this, you know, the 1930s and 40s, there weren't as many, but in the 50s, again, it built up. So if we save money 100 years from 1930 to 1940 in the 20s and 30s of 2000s, then we'll have the money when they start needing to be replaced, the 1950s and 1960s pipes.
When Doug is still here.
There you go.
Mr. Chairman, the only other question I had was, I was a little surprised to hear, when we were talking about whether you dig or whether you replace through, you know, the machinery that's coming on to reline things, that it's about the same. I was a bit surprised to hear that.
Just because the paving and it's more labor intensive.
But you said it was about the same, whether we.
Well, I'm sorry, yes.
So cleaning and relining is.
As opposed to digging.
Is probably slightly cheaper, right?
It is slightly
Okay.
cheaper.
Yeah.
I thought I'd heard that.
No,
was
it is
the
a
same.
slightly cheaper alternative because you have less expenses. But, you know, when you're talking millions of dollars, obviously, and you're going to do 2 miles, it's the economy of scale. But essentially, cut and cover is more expensive than the cleaning and relining technologies that are out there now.
And what is it, my final question was, if I'm on a street and my water line is gonna get relined, and I hate to even ask this, but what impact is it gonna have on the homeowner?
essentially before the project.
Is they gonna have to reconnect or replace, or?
No,
what
essentially
happens?
and there's different technologies for the relining. Some it's a spray, and it would just spray, and the orifice that goes for your service would just get sprayed around the edge and not actually get blocked, and therefore it would be, remain open. Another technology is they run a sock on the inside, and then they go through and they core out that and open it up. But before any of this work has to start or can begin, temporary water services are connected. So basically, you go from fire hydrant to fire hydrant, run a 4-inch line, and then services to each house. So there's fire protection and domestic use while that section of pipe is
And
offline.
and that's not on the homeowner, just I wanted to.
Oh, no,
No,
this is
right,
all
yeah,
covered in
Sorry,
the cost.
that would be a question I think a homeowner would ask.
And obviously, we'd have to coordinate getting into the house to shut the water off in the house and out in the street and so forth. But it's, you need a bypass to do this type of work.
Thank you.
Is there any other discussion? All right, hearing no other discussion, Jen, will you hold the board?
Selectman Bork?
Yes.
Selectman Miller?
Yes.
Selectman Becker?
Yes.
Chairman Jolda?
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Woods.
Yeah, thank you, Greg.
And with no other items on the agenda, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved, Mr.
Second.
Chairman.
Motion and a second, any discussion? Hearing no discussion, Jen, will you hold the board?
Selectman Bork?
Yes.
Selectman Miller?
Yes.
Selectman Becker?
Yes.
Chairman Jolda?
Yes.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.